And I'm moving on from my topic for today, which is the idea of evil is inspired by our Shabbat Zachor, which is to remember Amalek. So for the complete beginners, I'll say a few words about Amalek, say a few words about the theology of the idea of evil, meaning how do we understand a metaphysical world that includes the idea of God with the idea of evil, and then apply it to what's happening in the world today. So first of all, who is Amalek? We first meet Amalek back in the book of Genesis. You can look up Amalek. He is a grandson of Esau. Remember, Esau was the dispossessed brother of Yaakov. Now, I'm including my midrash on Rebekah here. When Jacob went up to live 20 years up in Padan Aram with his uncle Lavan, where he married Leah, Rachel, and concubines, and created a very big family that became the tribes of the people of Israel. Back in Beersheba, back in Canaan, Esau is left with murderous desire for revenge against Esau. He's motivated by hurt. I'll repeat some words from earlier today. Hurt, victimization, entitlement. Meaning he was entitled to the birthright. He was victimized by Jacob in his own mind, by extension, of course, by his mother, but it seems he wanted to stay with Jacob. A profound sense of resentment. So you put those things together, entitlement, victimization, and resentment, you have a very toxic brew for the expression of evil. In my mind, what happens, and this is my midrash on Rebekah, Rebekah becomes something like a great spiritual psychological coach and expert in the process of human inner repair. And her core and major client, as it were, was her son Esau. She had to get him better. In my fantasy, studies at the Beit Midrash of Shem and Ever and has the faculty of spiritual psychology. She turns it into a method. Esau eventually joins the faculty, and they do all they can to bring healing to the community of Beersheba and parts beyond. That's my midrash on my yet unwritten midrash on Rebekah. So, in any case, Esau is able to work himself through, but the narrative, the family narrative, that they were dispossessed by Jacob, and therefore, by extension, all of the Israelites. Now, this narrative is transferred down to Esau's children, and eventually grandchildren. Esau has a child named Eliphaz. You can look this up. Eliphaz then has a wife and a concubine. Now remember, the child of a concubine is dispossessed as far as being a fully legitimate son who enjoys full inheritance rights. So the son of Eliphaz, we'll say the concubine son of Eliphaz, if I'm remembering all this correctly, is Amalek. That's his name. So who is Amalek? Amalek is the grandson of Esau, okay? The son of Eliphaz, who's the son of Esau, and therefore the nephew of Jacob. It goes down to Amalek, and without spending a lot of time on the psychology of Amalek, although I've met this person many, many times, they grew up with a sense of, I was wronged. I could have had more. I'm entitled to more. And it's not because of my own deficiencies. Yes, maybe I started out in a way that did not give me a fair place at the starting line. That happens. We all don't get a fair place at the starting line for life. I've met people that were profoundly, as it were, prevented from what I would call a fair start, if there even is such a thing as a fair start. If one thing that a fair start starts with money, I can't tell you how many people in rehab that I met that were disabled from the beginning in spite of parents' wealth, in spite of status, and everything else that you think would give somebody a fair start. And on the other hand, I've met people who did not have wealth, did not have any kinds of connections, they didn't go to the best school, and they live lives as superb, excellent human beings. So I don't even really know what I mean by the word a fair start, but people have a narrative. I didn't get a fair start. I didn't have my place at the starting line to which I was entitled, and therefore I need to blame others. So again, here's our choice. Do we start out by asking, Is my failure at things I want from life due to the perfidy of other people? Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe some, maybe most, maybe a little. We can never quantify it. Or should I accept the tragedy of that which is my life, even if it is a tragedy? We'll start out in saying that people live in tragic circumstances. And is it my job to overcome and to work as hard as I can and work to three main things? This is what I recommend. Number one, to moral excellence. What is moral excellence? Knowing what your duty is and don't focus on what other people did or didn't do. Going back to the thing I mentioned a little bit earlier this morning, the person who said, well, I don't have a moral obligation to make things better in my family because of what other people did. I said to this person, moral obligations don't work that way. Moral obligations are moral obligations. Now, there are, of course, extenuating mitigating circumstances, but you're not relieved of a moral obligation because someone didn't perform their moral obligation. Yeah, it is a contributing factor in a moral analysis, but it doesn't discharge you from saying, I have a moral obligation to make things better. But when a person says, well, I was wronged, therefore I have no moral obligations, I only have the obligation of vengeance. Entitlement and vengeance. For entitlement, vengeance, and the sense of being wronged. All of this, in my mind, create the archetype of Amalek. I was wronged. I was not treated fairly. I have vengeance on my mind. I was entitled to something different, and I won't feel better until they're destroyed. Now, this is the fullness of the Amalek archetype. Amalek has taken all of Amalek's distress. Now we're talking about the grandson of Esau as an archetype. We're going to leave him in Genesis. He reappears in the book of Exodus, attacking the Israelites at their weakest point. In the caravan going through the desert, they attack in the rear among the weak and the elderly and the infirm. And you see this in the book of Exodus in Torah portion, Bashalach, as we're coming out of Egypt. Out of nowhere, Amalek attacks. So we say to ourselves, how long has Amalek been harboring this ideation of vengeance? How long has him? Now we're going to ask, it has to be cultural at some point. A culture of victim, a culture of vengeance, a culture of resentment. How long has that been brewing? Here's one thing we know. Resentment, victim status, the desire for vengeance, this can brew in a culture for decades and centuries. For decades and centuries. How do we know? Look what happened after Yugoslavia fell apart. All of a sudden, wars broke out between Serbia, Albania, Kosovo, between Christians and Muslims. And when I looked at the rallying cry of the Serbian Christians against local Muslim who were Croats and others, the rallying cries were from battles fought in the 1400s. There were rallying cries from battles fought in the 1400s, which Serbian culture had not yet forgotten, had been cultivated and brewing. And the minute Yugoslavia, which was a kind of an empire country of many, many different smaller nationalities, when Yugoslavia fell apart, the vengeance agenda came forward and led to the slaughter in the Balkans that those of us of a certain age remember from the 1990s. What was this about? It was about stored vengeance. It was about hatred. It was about resentment, etc. So can these things be stored up culturally over decades and centuries? Absolutely. Are these things stored up in human beings over a lifetime? Absolutely. People die with this until they choose not to. Now, what happens? If these strong feelings, and there are others, by the way, I want to mention these in particular because it is Shabbat Zachor, and Amalek is our archetype. If these strong feelings of victimization, entitlement that is denied somebody that they think they are entitled to, resentment, etc., if they're not overridden by a more powerful force for reasoning well about yourself, other people, the human condition, and a moral honor code. If you are not restrained by a passion for reasoning, rational insight into other people, some deep philosophic grasp of the tragedy of the human condition, all in the sense of a moral code where it says, it doesn't matter how I feel, there are some things I just do and don't do. That's the power of the moral code. If one does not have these things in my mind, this is the invitation for evil. Now, I want to think about this. If you have such a narrative and you have no restraint, right? I've read enough true crime books, I've seen enough movies, and I've read enough history to know that when such people have any kind of position and power, they often do lash out in the most atrocious ways because they're suffering from the toxic brew of an entitlement that wasn't granted them, a victim status, some kind of narrative, resentment, and vengeance, and then the opportunity. They have plenty of motivation. They find the means, they have the moment of opportunity, and there they go because they do not have a moral code that restrains them. So from my mind, evil is a matter of degree. The kinds of things that I've seen in families are bad, very bad. And I've seen, witnessed, or heard about people who had spots of evil. They did despicable things because of what I'm talking about. They had the means, the opportunity, and they knew no real consequences. Why'd they do it? Because they could. There would be no consequences. No one would chastise them. And I remember when me, Rob, and I saw this a few times, we thought to ourselves, why would a person do such a thing? We would say, because they could. They had all the preparatory things that they needed in order to act such a way. No restraint, no consequences. People do things because they can in this way. Now, I've seen spots of this. Certainly when I was, growing up in a rough neighborhood, I laugh because I don't know what else to do. But I remember, I shared this often when I was a white kid in Compton, so these black hoodlums persecuted me, and I remember one time in particular when someone chased me with a tree branch, caught me on someone's porch, and was beating me mercilessly with a limb of a tree. And I was pounding on the door, the person wouldn't answer. And I just thought, well, they hate white people that much that it's my turn today. And I remember looking in that person's eyes, and I just could see, I could see something that was so overcome by both rage, a kind of a predatory pleasure in beating that which was the object of all things I just talked about. It actually was more frightening than the beating. The beating I could take. What I saw in that person's eyes was utterly frightening to me, and I remember thinking to myself, I think I've seen evil. I saw it many other times, stories I don't care to share, but that's one I've shared before. I'm not afraid of sharing, but I remember looking at that moment, I could still see this person's eyes, and that scared me more than the beating, because I realized there was no limit to this. Luckily, we left Compton before guns arrived. Back in my day, it was just beatings with blunt objects. So I think I saw it a few times. But then, of course, in my studies of history, my study of the Holocaust, state of things going on today, this kind of hatred, when the motivation is there, but then the means move into the level of weapons, including knives, blunt instruments, guns, gas chambers, and the moment of opportunity. We look at the different genocides in the Balkans, in Rwanda, of course in Nazi Germany, the Japanese genocide in China, and of course the genocide of the Jews and what happened on October 7th. For me, this accounts for it. Meaning something happens inside of people, they build this victim narrative, they're filled with resentment, entitlement, it focuses into a displaced hatred on this one group, where the idea is, if you didn't exist, I would feel better because I'm taking all of my pain, all of my resentment onto one group. If I get rid of you, I get rid of everybody. Of course, it doesn't happen that way, because what we've seen is that this kind of evil ideation, it has no limit. It is never satisfied. The hunger is never extinguished. It's like an addiction. Because once any addiction reaches a certain point of being satisfied, the urge for more kicks in. That's in traditional addictions, but even addictions to murder, even addictions to act out the things that I've talked about a little bit earlier this morning, even those things have an addictive quality where there's no point where a person stops and says, I've killed enough. There's always more to kill. And when I'm done with this group, I'll just move to another group. This is what happens to sometimes radical groups, is that once they take care of the major enemy, then they start slicing more and more thinly, who is of pure consciousness, and they start exterminating their own group. We say this phrase, they end up eating their children because this pathology, this addictive pathology for evil just grows and grows and grows. So clearly I moved into our talk for today, and there's several kinds of evil I want to talk about. I'm going to start very far afield. I remember after the murder of George Floyd, and I came out very strongly against it. By the way, I lost a lot of friends and a lot of synagogue members because I didn't say, but George Floyd was a drug addict and George Floyd was this. He's an American. He's a child of God, and I believe he was. I think he was murdered. Now I didn't say anything about police in general. I didn't say anything about black people in general. I say that man was murdered, and we have to call it what it is. Now, it's in the context of, I think, our society never having fully addressed in a sustained way with the proper leadership with the sin of slavery. I think we've had opportunities. They were all missed terribly and dramatically. It's still a reckoning to come to talk honestly about the sin of slavery. And I have a lot to say about that, but I don't think it's possible today because of the political agendas of too many groups. Put that aside for a moment. But one thing I don't do, I don't blame all white people. That's impossible. When I think, what are white people? Is it people from Kazakhstan, from Armenia, right? From Poland, from Hungary? Look who's white in America. Right, so all of the all Irish Americans, all Scots Americans. I mean, which white people are we going to say is responsible until we actually come down to who is responsible? So this idea of taking some kind of racial group and saying it's all you, the minute you arrive on American shores, you are guilty. You are part of some white supremacist plot. I thought this was absurd, ridiculous, and frightening because it falls right into the aggrieved person who's been robbed of something to which they were entitled, I think morally entitled, with an agenda of vengeance, of resentment, has to find, in an unworked out position, without some kind of deep, rational, moral, spiritual reflection, has to find the cause, has to find the blame, the Jew, as it were. Has to be Amalek finding their Israel. So after George Floyd, when people were going after white cops, I said, whoa, it's not cops, and it's not because they're white. You've gone too far. But again, that was the movement. White cops. I said to me, this is going to end up being white people. Well, within 2 years it was. Within 2 years it wasn't white cops. It was white supremacy. You can remember those who have been in conversation with me. I tried, well, what exactly is this? If it's everywhere, then it's somewhere. Can we go one institution at a time and show them how exactly this works? As you know, all those conversations met with abject failure because we were talking about a religious idea, not an actual sociological fact. And when you're dealing with religious ideas that there's some kind of metaphysical evil that's instantiated with one racial group, folks, that's an opening to genocide. Whenever you say that a metaphysical evil has rested into some group of people and they're all infected with it, that's an opening to discrimination. It's an opening to, I think, verbal abuse. I think the worst kinds of lashon hara and eventually violence and murder. Okay, so I think we should stop this wherever it starts, no matter, even if you think the protected group doesn't need much protecting, it's the process that we're fighting against. We're not defending a group, we're defending what I would call the holiness of the world of ideas. So we ask ourselves, what's happening on the college campuses? Why Israel? It's Amalek. People, I think, are morally confused and bored. There's no passion for justice anywhere. I think people don't know what to do. I think people in some ways are don't have any moral passion for anything because there's no direction on what to do. We've tried so hard to fix our social problems. There's no direction. But once you can come up with one group that stands for all the evil of the world, not what's happening in Sudan, not ISIS, not the repressive regime in North Korea or in China for that matter. You can ignore all of the oppression, all of the murder, all of the genocide all over the world. It's just too complex. Pick one. So this is evil slacktivism. Yeah, they're being active, but it's slacktivism. It's so easy to hate Israel and hate the Jews. There's no complexity, right? You don't have to learn any facts. You can have slogans that kind of rhyme with each other. So what's happened is I think you have a bored, morally confused generation with no training or commitment to rationality, look at lies that are devoid of meaning, and suddenly given a rallying cry. And who cares if it ends up in the death of Jews? They don't care. Even Jews on the hard left don't care that it ends up with the death of Jews, because the idea of writing an argument of the pseudo-righteousness is actually more important than the lives of innocent people. It is that bad. It's that bad. Anybody who doesn't admit that, a ceasefire means a defeat for Israel, which in my mind is a defeat for Western civilization if Hamas survives this. I'm not exaggerating. I mean it with all my heart. If Hamas is not defeated, the Israeli army is defeated, which means this evil coalition of Hamas and Iran and the Houthis, and by extension, China and Russia, they win if Israel does not defeat Hamas. There's a lot at stake here. So I'm very disturbed by all this, and I want to call it what it is. And I know this sounds maybe very, very like a rhetorical flourish. I don't mean it to be. I actually have thought about this a lot this week. And that is, there's a war against good and evil. And it's happening right now. And it's happening on college campuses. It's happening in many parts of American culture. It all suffers from great moral confusion, no moral conviction. But I think the overriding desire to empathetically identify with a pseudo-oppressed group of thugs and murderers and rapists and barbarians, but they get to be called the oppressed group because it solves the moral dilemma of a life without meaning, a life without moral passion. That's what we're facing. So what do we each have to do? First of all, we have to stay relentlessly informed with great knowledge, because every conversation I've had with people about this, their questions are tropes. You start to talk one thing, they go to this one, and then it's the end, and they have nothing to say. Now, most of it doesn't matter because it's their religion. It's the religion of anti-Semitism. It's the religion of vengeance, resentment, entitlement, etc. It's become their religion. There's nothing you can say. They just move on to the next uninformed person. But for those who have not converted to this evil caricature of a religion, but actually want to know, we have to be the ones who know. So our mastery of the facts must be relentless, constant, and complete for the person who has not converted to this evil pseudo-religion. There are people who don't know. They're confused. We have to be the people who can inform them. And secondly, I think for all the complexity of things that have, and there is great moral complexity here, all moral arguments ultimately come down to a few points, and I want us to master these few points as carefully as we can to help people think clearly. I'll just repeat them today, and then I'll stop. So of all the moral complexity, I want to share, as I've had this discussions over and over again, here's how I conduct. The person says, it's so complex, it's all political. What about the occupation? Who's to know? I said, okay, can I help you? I meant this a week ago. I'll say it again. Would we agree it's a war over land? It is a war over land. Yes. Two groups claim the same land. Yes, I would agree. Two groups claim the same land. And each group claims that it, as it were, owns the land, which means doesn't only possess the land, but has a moral right to the land. I think that sums it up. People have, I'd only just possess it. I don't just live there. I have a moral right to it. And there's two claims of moral ownership of the land, meaning ownership is metaphysical. It's not physical. You can't do a soil test. So possession and ownership are metaphysical ideas. They're not physical ideas. Aside from being on land, I think most people would agree that being on the land might be a prima facie claim for moral ownership, but not necessarily. So we'll just agree. Two different peoples, roughly, have moral claims, which are metaphysical claims. Okay? Hope I'm on the right track. And there's no way to prove a metaphysical argument with empirical means. That's something everybody has to know cold. You cannot prove a moral argument with empirical means. So if someone says, well, someone lived there before, say, okay, does that provide moral ownership? And if so, how? How does prior inhabitant create moral ownership? Which means an empirical fact, people who live there create a metaphysical fact called ownership. Now, they may have an answer. I'd love to know what it is. Because when a person says they've been there for generations, I say, okay, thank you. So you're saying at some point in time, when a given people invade from Saudi Arabia, bring in their language and exterminate the indigenous population, push out their language, which was Greek and Aramaic of the inhabitants before the Arabs arrived, extinguish their religion, which was Christianity, and supplant their language, Arabic, and their religion, Islam, how long before they become the rightful owners? It means at one point did the indigenous people have no moral claim to land? I'd love an answer. You obviously have an answer. 100 years. I said, okay, so after 100 years, once you exterminate the prior religion, supplant the language, destroy the culture, colonize, within 100 years, the ownership goes to the new people. Is that what I'm hearing? I'm just trying. I want to understand their theory. I'm not claiming anything. But if you're going to claim that being an inhabitant creates ownership, you got to have a theory. They say, yeah, okay, 100 years after they destroyed the religion of the indigenous population, which was Christianity, destroyed their language, which was Greek and Aramaic, and we don't have any records what happened to the inhabitants. We don't know if they just all were converted to Islam. We don't know forcibly or not. But suddenly by the 1200s, it was a Muslim country, as far as we know. I said, okay. So now, there could be a claim, I can say to them, that the claims of the indigenous population weren't extinguished. And there's no way to prove that, right? There's no way to adjudicate whether Christians want the land back. I mean, Christians are a people. They don't speak Greek, but that was behind the Crusade. The Crusade said, wait a minute, we Christians as a people, we actually don't agree to the moral ownership of the land by the Muslims. We want the land back. We used to be Christian. You stole it from us. We're getting it back. I said, were the Crusaders invaders or were they rightful prior owners as a group called Christians? Now, I actually don't even mind stopping the conversation right there. Because in having such a conversation, the only thing I intend to do is shake up the idea, my ancestors lived there, therefore it's ours, and therefore we get to kill the Jewish inhabitants. I just want to put a little bit of unsturdiness in that idea. A little bit of theoretical unsturdiness, like crack an aperture open and say, now let's talk about the distinction between living on the land, having a moral right to the land, especially disputed land with other people. So now we're back to a war. And I don't mean to minimize this, it's just a war. It's just a war. I understand you want to win the war. My last question might be, okay, you want Palestine free of Jews, which means genocide from the river to the sea. I get that. October 7th was about that, yes. I said, what was the goal of October 7th? Well, people were oppressed. That's not a goal. That's an explanation of desire for vengeance. I get that. What was the goal of October? If you can even get this far, what was the goal? What was the goal of October 7th? Murder. Murder and hostages. That was the goal. They accomplished it. Good for them, from the viewpoint of the cosmos, if there's no moral reality, you wanted something, you went out and got it, in the world of David Hume, where our passions are, passions are not in any way metaphysically restricted by right and wrong. You want something, you got it, good for you. You murdered a bunch of people. You took hostages. You raped women. You burnt them alive. Good for you. There's no moral reality. You got what you wanted. All right, so now the Israelis are getting what they want. You want to all of a sudden take it to a moral court where you have no moral restraint on your side. You just get what you want. You have to murder, cut people apart, commit barbarity to get it. And when somebody says, okay, you want to fight that kind of war, we're going to fight that kind of war. Suddenly you want about morality. Where's morality on October 7th? Well, they were oppressed. That's not an excuse for anything. I'm sorry to say. Oppression doesn't license murder. Oppression does not license atrocity, burning people to death, taking hostages. There's no moral code in the world that says, well, when you get that oppressed, then you can murder people, right? Unless they have such a moral code. I'd love to hear about it because I have a moral code. My moral code is this. Okay? I promise I'll end here today. My moral code is this. As most of you know, our daughter, Shulamit, was supposed to be there at Nova on October 7th. She's in Canada, getting ready to go home to Nova. Because it was her mother's birthday, she came home to be with us instead of going to Nova. She had tickets. Our daughter, Avigal, was going to go to Nova. She thought it might be too crowded, so she went camping not far from Nova in a ravine in the Negev. Those 12 hours of Nova, we could not get in touch with our daughter. Our worst fears were they were among the victims or the hostages. Those are our worst fears. Like thousands and thousands of Israelis whose children were not murdered and not taken hostage and not were victims of atrocity, could have been. Do I have any limit of what I would do to get my kid back? If we're playing by Hamas rules, personally, do I have a limit of what I would do to get my kid back if we're playing by Hamas rules? If October 7th is the game you want to play, I'll play your game. That's how I feel. So yeah, I feel bad that innocent people are dying, but not bad enough not to want to get my kid back by your rules. That's where I'm at. I'm glad I'm not in charge because the world would look a lot uglier and probably not run this war in a smart way if I were in charge. I'm glad someone else is dealing with all the political realities of managing world opinion and managing President Biden and the American representative system. I get it. Okay? But I'm raw. I'm still raw, which is one reason we have to be in Israel. We're so raw we cannot be away from Israel right now. But we take all this complexity. It's about war. We're not going to solve it in some kind of great court of human, of some kind of moral distinction. That'll never work. No one's going to be. The enemy will not be convinced by it. It's just a war. You shared with us the rules of war on October 7th. You don't change the rules of war after you have your day. This is my opinion. Now, of course, Israel has moral restraint. They don't just have feelings, which are strong. Israelis also have a moral code. So they're conducting the war with a moral code. But I want to say to you, I don't believe in a ceasefire before Hamas is defeated. That's the bottom line. I'm headed to war today. This is such an evil that a ceasefire before Hamas is defeated is in the service of the evil that we have to fight.